They told him his trick was useless, farm boy nonsense, something you'd do herding cattle, not fighting a war. But when 8 veteran pilots couldn't tell which way was up, they stopped laughing. This is the story of how a Wisconsin dairy farmer became the most confusing pilot in the European theater, and why the Luftwaffe put a bounty on a man who never fired a shot in anger. December 1943. 8th Air Force, 351st Bombardment Group, Polbrook, England. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and wet wool. Captain James Holloway stood in front of 32 bomber crews and explained that tomorrow's mission to Bremen would be different. They'd have a new escort pilot flying cover. His name was 2nd Lieutenant Vernon Kessler, fresh out of training, 21 years old, from a place called Sheboygan Falls that nobody had ever heard of. The room groaned. Green pilots were dangerous. They broke formation. They wasted fuel chasing ghosts. They got good men killed because they didn't know what they didn't know. Holloway raised his hand for silence and said something nobody expected. This kid had already confused 3 instructors so badly during training that they'd grounded him for a week just to figure out what he was doing. The thing was, they never did figure it out. And now, he was their problem. Kessler showed up to the flight line the next morning, looking exactly like what he was. Thin shoulders, hands too big for his frame. Face that had never needed a razor more than twice a week. He walked up to his P-47 Thunderbolt like he was approaching a spooked horse, touched the cowling gently, spoke to it. One of the ground crew asked him what he was saying. Kessler looked up with those pale blue eyes and said he was just letting her know what they were about to do. The crew chief walked away, shaking his head. The mission brief was simple. 15 B-17s would hit the shipyards at Bremen. 4 P-47s would escort them in. 4 more would escort them out. Kessler was flying tail-end Charlie on the inbound leg, the worst position, the spot where you ate everyone else's prop wash and watched for bandits nobody else could see yet. It was a test. If he could handle that, maybe he'd survive long enough to learn something. They were wheels up at 0600. The sky was the color of an old bruise. Weather report said clouds at 8,000 feet, clear above 12. Perfect bombing weather, terrible fighting weather. You couldn't see what was coming until it was already on you. Kessler held his position. Didn't talk on the radio, didn't drift, just flew that Thunderbolt like it was attached to the bomber formation with an invisible rope. 30 minutes from target, the Luftwaffe showed up. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s came screaming out of the cloud deck at 2 o'clock high. The lead American fighter, a hotshot from Texas named Cordell, called the break and went after them. Standard doctrine. Intercept before they reached the bombers. Kessler didn't follow. He held position. Cordell's voice crackled over the radio, angry. He ordered Kessler to engage. Kessler clicked his mic twice. Acknowledgement without agreement. He stayed right where he was. That's when 4 more 190s came up from below. The real attack. The first 6 had been bait. Kessler had seen it somehow, or sensed it, or maybe he'd just gotten lucky. Either way, he was the only fighter in position when they made their run. He pushed the stick forward and dove on the lead German fighter. The 190 pilot saw him coming and did exactly what 8,000 hours of combat experience told him to do. He broke hard left and pulled up into a climbing spiral. Textbook evasion. Impossible for a pursuing fighter to follow without losing energy and becoming a target himself. Kessler did something nobody expected. He broke right, dove instead of climbed. Then he did something that looked completely wrong. He rolled inverted and pulled back on the stick, bleeding speed letting the 190 pull away. Every pilot watching thought he'd lost his mind. You don't let an enemy get separation. You don't give up an advantage. You definitely don't fly upside down in the middle of a dogfight. But Kessler wasn't losing the 190. He was hurting him. That's what the German pilot realized too late. Every move he made to escape just put him exactly where Kessler wanted him. Right back toward the bomber formation where 3 other American fighters were waiting. The 190 pilot found himself boxed in by 4 P-47s without understanding how he'd gotten there. He took 16 rounds in the engine cowling and went down trailing black smoke. Kessler never fired a shot. The remaining Germans broke off. They'd come expecting green American pilots flying predictable patterns. Instead, they'd found something they couldn't predict, something that didn't make sense. After the bombers dropped their payloads and turned for home, Cordell pulled up alongside Kessler's fighter, asked him over the radio what the hell that was. Kessler's response was 3 words: cutting out a calf. Back at Polbrook, the intelligence officer wanted a full debrief. Kessler explained it the same way he'd explained it to his training instructors. On the farm, when you wanted to separate one calf from the herd, you didn't chase it. You moved it. You positioned yourself so that every direction it could run was the wrong direction. You made it think it was escaping when really it was going exactly where you wanted. The cattle didn't know they were being herded. They just knew something was wrong. The intelligence officer wrote it all down and looked at Kessler like he'd started speaking German. Fighters didn't herd. They pursued. They attacked. They defended. The entire doctrine of aerial combat was built on aggression and position. What Kessler was describing wasn't in any manual. It wasn't even a tactic. It was instinct. Farm boy instinct. The kind of thing you couldn't teach because it came from somewhere that had nothing to do with airplanes or war. The other pilots didn't know what to make of him. Some thought he was brilliant. Others thought he was lucky. Most thought he was dangerous because nobody could predict what he'd do next. If your wingman was unpredictable, he wasn't just a risk to the enemy. He was a risk to you. They started calling him the Scarecrow, not as an insult, as a warning. When Kessler was in the air, things didn't work the way they were supposed to. 3 days later, they flew another mission. This time to Wilhelmshaven, Kessler was flying wing position for a captain named Del Vecchio, who had 43 missions under his belt and very strong opinions about how fighter escorts should behave. He briefed Kessler before takeoff. Stay in formation. Follow orders. Don't get creative. Kessler nodded and said yes, sir, to everything. Del Vecchio didn't believe him for a second. The mission went sideways before they even reached the target. German flak batteries had moved overnight. The bomber group flew right into a curtain of 88mm fire that should have been 3 miles south. 2 B-17s went down in the first 30 seconds. The formation broke apart trying to evade. Suddenly, there were bombers scattered across 15 miles of sky with no organized fighter cover and German interceptors inbound from every direction. Del Vecchio made the call. Fighters would split up and try to cover as many bombers as possible until the formation could reorganize. Every pilot acknowledged and picked a section of broken bombers to protect. Kessler acknowledged too. Then he did something different. He climbed, straight up, full throttle, away from the bombers, away from the fight, away from everything. Del Vecchio saw him go and lost his mind on the radio, called him a coward, threatened him with a court-martial, ordered him to get back in position. Kessler didn't respond, just kept climbing. 18,000 feet, 20,000, 22. The air was so thin and cold that ice was forming on his canopy. He was burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and he was completely alone. Then he rolled over and dove, came screaming back down at a 45-degree angle with the throttle wide open, passed through 20,000 feet doing 400 miles per hour, 16,000, 12,000. He wasn't heading for the bombers. He was heading for a patch of empty sky 2 miles north of the formation. There was nothing there, just clouds and cold air and the distant landscape of occupied France below. Except there was something there. Kessler had seen what nobody else had seen, a shadow in the clouds, a dark line that didn't quite match the way light was supposed to work. He'd spent 21 years watching weather move across Wisconsin fields, watching the way wind bent grass, watching the way temperature differences made the air shimmer above summer roads. He knew when something wasn't right, and that shadow wasn't right. He opened fire at 8,000 feet. 50 caliber rounds tore through the cloud bank in 8 parallel lines of tracers. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a Messerschmitt 110 came tumbling out of the clouds with both engines on fire and the canopy blown apart. It had been sitting there, waiting, watching the American formation break apart, waiting for the perfect moment to make a single devastating gun run on the scattered bombers. Kessler had killed it before it even knew it had been spotted, but he wasn't done. He pulled out of his dive at 4,000 feet and immediately broke left. There was another shadow, another wrong place in the sky. He fired again. Another Mi-110 came apart. This one didn't even have time to react, just disintegrated in a cloud of metal and fire. Then Kessler pulled up hard and called out 3 more positions over the radio. He told Del Vecchio exactly where the other German fighters were hiding. Not approximately, exactly, like he could see through clouds. The American fighters converged on each position, found German aircraft exactly where Kessler said they'd be, destroyed all 3 before they could engage the bombers. In less than 4 minutes, Kessler had eliminated an entire German ambush that nobody else knew was there. He'd done it by climbing away from the fight, by ignoring orders, by trusting something that had nothing to do with military training. When they landed back at Polbrook, Del Vecchio walked straight to Kessler's fighter before the engine had even stopped. Kessler climbed down expecting to be arrested. Instead, Del Vecchio grabbed him by the shoulder and asked him one question. "How did you see them?" Kessler tried to explain. Something about the way clouds moved when there was metal inside them. Something about temperature and air pressure and the way a cow's breath looked on a cold morning. Del Vecchio just stared at him. Then he walked away without another word. The intelligence officer filed a report. It went up the chain to Group Command. Group Command sent it to Division. Division sent it to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Within a week, 3 different training officers showed up at Polbrook to observe Kessler. They wanted to understand what he was doing so they could teach it to other pilots. They interviewed him for 6 hours, made him draw diagrams, watched him fly training sorties. At the end of it, they concluded that what Kessler did couldn't be taught. It was intuition, pattern recognition that operated below the level of conscious thought. You either had it or you didn't, and he had it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. What happened next changed everything. Command decided that if they couldn't teach other pilots to do what Kessler did, they'd use him differently. Instead of flying standard escort missions, he'd fly what they called free hunt patrols. No fixed route, no assigned bombers. He'd go up with a flight of 4 fighters and look for trouble. More specifically, he'd look for German fighters that were hiding, waiting, setting up ambushes, and he'd destroy them before they became a threat. The first free hunt patrol went up on January 7, 1944. Kessler led 3 experienced pilots into French airspace with no specific target, just orders to disrupt German operations however they saw fit. They flew for 40 minutes without seeing anything. The other pilots were getting nervous. Fuel was finite. Time was finite. You couldn't just wander around occupied Europe hoping to stumble into the enemy. But Kessler wasn't wandering. He was reading the sky. He noticed that there were no contrails above 18,000 feet, even though the temperature was right for them. That meant German fighters were staying low. Hiding under the cloud deck, he dropped down to 12,000 feet and started flying a search pattern that made no sense to anyone but him. North for 3 minutes, west for 2, south for 5, east for 1. The other pilots thought he was lost. Then he called out a bearing and told everyone to get ready. 30 seconds later, they found 6 Focke-Wulf 190s flying in tight formation just above the clouds. The Germans were guarding something. Kessler didn't attack. He watched, followed them from a distance, let them lead him to what they were protecting. 5 minutes later, he found it. A group of Ju-88 bombers being refueled at a hidden forward airfield. 16 aircraft on the ground, sitting ducks. Kessler's flight made 1 pass, destroyed 11 bombers and damaged 4 more. The 190s tried to intercept, but they were out of position. By the time they could engage, the American fighters were already gone. The entire attack took 90 seconds. The damage took the Luftwaffe 3 weeks to repair, and Kessler had found the target by watching the way German fighters were flying and understanding what their behavior meant. He did it again 4 days later, found a German command post by noticing that there were more radio transmissions coming from one area than the terrain should support. Did it again a week after that. Located a hidden fuel depot by watching the flight paths of German supply aircraft and calculating where they were going based on how long they stayed away from their home base. Every time, he found something that intelligence said didn't exist. And every time, he was right. The Luftwaffe noticed. They started changing tactics, flying irregular patterns, using decoys, setting up fake installations to draw American fighters into traps. It didn't matter. Kessler could tell the difference between a real German operation and a fake one, the same way a farmer could tell the difference between a sick cow and a healthy one. There were signs, small things that didn't add up, and he saw all of them. By March 1944, German pilots had started calling him Vogelscheuche, Scarecrow. The name had traveled across the channel. They knew his fighter by the markings, knew his tactics, or rather, they knew they couldn't predict his tactics. Some German units refused to fly in sectors where he was known to operate. Others requested transfers. There were rumors that the Luftwaffe had put a bounty on him, 5,000 Reichsmarks for the pilot who shot him down. Nobody ever collected. One of the veteran pilots at Polbrook asked him how he did it, how he saw things nobody else could see. Kessler thought about it for a long time before answering. He said that on the farm, you survived by paying attention. You watched the animals, watched the weather, watched the way light moved across the fields. If you paid attention, the land told you what was going to happen before it happened. A change in the wind meant rain. A cow separating from the herd meant sickness. Birds flying low meant a storm was coming. The sky over Europe wasn't that different from the sky over Wisconsin. It was just telling him different things. The other pilot didn't really understand. but he didn't need to. What mattered was that Kessler kept finding German aircraft that should have been invisible, kept disrupting operations that should have been secret, kept surviving missions that should have killed him. By April, he'd been credited with 11 confirmed kills. But that number didn't really capture what he'd done. He'd prevented dozens of German attacks, saved hundreds of American lives, changed the way the 8th Air Force thought about fighter tactics. Then came the mission that almost ended everything. May 12, 1944. Kessler was leading a free hunt patrol over northern France when his number 3 man took flak damage and had to turn back. That left 3 fighters instead of 4. Not ideal, but manageable. They continued the patrol. 40 minutes later, Kessler spotted something wrong. A formation of what looked like American P-51 Mustangs flying at 15,000 feet heading east. Except they weren't American. Kessler knew it immediately. The formation was too tight. The spacing was wrong. The way they moved through the air was wrong. These were German fighters painted to look like Mustangs. It was a trick the Luftwaffe had tried before. Capture or salvage American aircraft. Repaint them. Use them to get close to bomber formations before opening fire. Most American pilots couldn't tell the difference until it was too late, but Kessler could. He radioed a warning to any American units in the area, told them there were hostile aircraft in captured planes heading east. Then he made a decision that everyone said was crazy. He attacked. 3 American fighters against 8 German fighters that had the element of surprise and were specifically hunting for Allied aircraft to deceive. The smart move was to avoid contact and let someone else deal with it. Kessler went after them anyway. The Germans saw him coming and dropped the disguise, broke formation and turned to engage. They had numbers. They had position. They had experience. What they didn't have was any idea what Kessler was about to do. He didn't dogfight them, didn't try to outmaneuver them. Instead, he flew straight at the lead aircraft and forced a game of chicken. The German pilot thought he was insane, thought he was going to ram, broke off at the last second. That put him out of position. Vulnerable. Kessler's wingman killed him 3 seconds later. The remaining 7 Germans tried to surround the American fighters. Standard pack tactics. Kessler split his flight, sent his 2 wingmen east, went west himself. The Germans had to choose which target to follow. They split their force. 4 went after Kessler, 3 went after his wingmen. That's exactly what he wanted. He just turned an 8 versus 3 fight into 2 separate engagements. 4 versus 1 and 3 versus 2. The math was still bad, but it was better. Kessler led his 4 pursuers into a series of maneuvers that made no sense. He climbed, then dove, then climbed again. Turned left, then right, then left again. Didn't shoot, didn't engage, just flew in patterns that seemed random. The Germans stayed with him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He didn't make mistakes. He made choices, and every choice moved all 5 aircraft exactly where he wanted them. After 3 minutes, he'd led them over a sector of sky that American bombers had passed through 30 minutes earlier. The sector was still full of bomber contrails. White lines crisscrossing at different altitudes. Kessler flew into the middle of the contrails and disappeared. The Germans followed him in and immediately lost sight of him. You couldn't see through contrails, couldn't tell which direction a plane was going once it entered one. It was like flying into fog. Kessler knew where every contrail was. He'd watched the bombers create them. He knew their altitude, their direction, their density. He flew through them like they were streets in his hometown. The Germans were lost. They broke formation trying to find him. Started calling out to each other on the radio. Started making mistakes. That's when Kessler came out of the contrails behind one of them and fired a 2-second burst. The German fighter exploded. The other 3 scattered. Meanwhile, his 2 wingmen had managed to hold off their 3 opponents. Nobody had been shot down, but the Germans had the advantage. Then Kessler showed up, came diving out of the contrails with 3 angry German pilots chasing him, led them straight through the middle of the other dogfight. Suddenly there were 8 aircraft in the same piece of sky, all turning and firing. Complete chaos. Except it wasn't chaos to Kessler. It was organized. He'd just herded all 7 remaining German fighters into a single furball where American training and aircraft performance gave his side the advantage. The fight lasted another 2 minutes. When it was over, 5 German fighters were destroyed. 2 had managed to escape. All 3 American aircraft were damaged but flyable. Kessler had a hole in his left wing the size of a dinner plate and hydraulic fluid leaking from a severed line. He made it back to Polbrook on emergency power and landed with no brakes. Ran off the end of the runway into a muddy field and nosed over. Walked away without a scratch. The after-action report called it the most tactically brilliant engagement of the month. The squadron commander called it the luckiest damn thing he'd ever seen. Kessler didn't call it anything. He just went back to his barracks, wrote a letter to his parents, and slept for 12 hours. When he woke up, there were 3 generals waiting to talk to him. They wanted to promote him, make him a trainer, use his skills to develop new doctrine. Kessler said no. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just knew that what he did couldn't be taught. It would be a waste of time, his time, their time. The generals didn't like that answer. You didn't tell generals no. But Kessler wasn't being insubordinate. He was being honest. They could promote him if they wanted. They could ground him if they wanted. But they couldn't turn him into something he wasn't. They promoted him anyway, made him a captain, gave him command of his own flight. Let him keep flying free hunt patrols because that's where he was most effective. And they stopped trying to understand how he did what he did. Some men were natural shots. Some men were natural leaders. Kessler was a natural hunter. That was enough. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Between May and August 1944, Kessler flew 63 combat missions. He was credited with 19 confirmed kills and 12 probables. But those numbers didn't tell the real story. The real story was in the German operations that failed because Kessler found them first. The ambushes that never happened. The bomber formations that made it home because German fighters were too afraid to attack when he was in the area. He'd become a psychological weapon. Just knowing he might be up there changed how the Luftwaffe operated. In September, he got a week of leave, went to London, walked around the city looking at buildings that were half destroyed and people who were still going to work. He met a British pilot in a pub who asked him what he did. Kessler said he flew fighters. The British pilot asked if he'd gotten any kills. Kessler said a few. The British pilot bought him a drink and told him that the real heroes were the bomber crews. The men who flew into flak every day, knowing they probably wouldn't survive their tour. Kessler agreed. He'd never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a farmer who'd learned to fly. He went back to Polbrook and found out his flight had been reassigned. They were joining the 9th Air Force, ground attack missions, supporting the invasion forces pushing across France. It was different work. Lower altitude, more flak, less dogfighting, more strafing runs on German positions. Kessler adapted. He started using his instincts to read ground defenses the same way he'd read air defenses. Found hidden anti-aircraft positions by watching where German ground troops weren't standing. Located supply convoys by noticing where roads showed recent repair work. October 1944. His flight was tasked with supporting an advance near Aachen. American forces were held up by German artillery that intelligence couldn't locate. Kessler volunteered to find it, went up alone, flew a search pattern over the sector for 30 minutes, found the artillery by noticing that birds weren't flying over a particular patch of forest. Something in that forest was making noise, loud noise, regular noise, noise that scared birds. He called in coordinates. American counter-battery fire destroyed the position 20 minutes later. The advance continued. November brought the weather. Cold rain, low clouds, limited visibility. Combat operations slowed down. Pilots sat in ready rooms playing cards and waiting for breaks in the weather that never came. Kessler didn't mind. He'd grown up in Wisconsin. Cold and wet didn't bother him. He used the downtime to write letters. He wrote to his parents every week, told them about the other pilots, about the planes, about England. Never told them about the combat. Didn't want them to worry more than they already were. December brought the bulge. The Germans launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Caught everyone by surprise. Suddenly American forces were surrounded, undersupplied, and fighting in the worst weather of the war. Air support was almost impossible. The cloud ceiling was so low that most pilots couldn't fly. Kessler could. He'd flown in worse weather over Wisconsin, knew how to navigate when you couldn't see anything but gray clouds and occasional glimpses of ground. He flew 8 missions in 3 days. Brought back intelligence on German troop movements that commanders said shouldn't have been possible to gather. One mission stands out. December 23rd. Kessler was escorting a supply drop to surrounded American troops near Bastogne. The weather was so bad that 3 other pilots had already turned back. Kessler kept going. Found the drop zone by using terrain features he'd memorized from maps. Couldn't see more than 100 yards in any direction. Guided the transport in anyway. The supplies were delivered. Then, on the way back, Kessler spotted something through a break in the clouds. German tanks. A lot of them. Moving toward American positions that didn't know they were coming. He couldn't attack them. Wrong ordnance. Wrong aircraft for the mission. He was low on fuel. The smart thing was to radio the position and get back to base. Instead, he made several low passes over the tank column. fired his guns into the ground in front of them. Didn't hit anything. Just made noise, made them stop, made them think they'd been spotted by a larger force. By the time they realized it was a single fighter, Kessler was gone, but they'd lost 30 minutes. 30 minutes that gave American forces time to reposition, time that might have saved 100 lives. January 1945. The Bulge was over. The Germans were retreating. Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany. Kessler's flight was flying interdiction missions, hitting supply lines, destroying bridges, strafing German columns on the roads. It was brutal work, low-level flying through heavy flak. Every mission, somebody didn't come back. Kessler kept flying, kept surviving, kept finding targets that other pilots missed. February. He was promoted to major, given command of an entire squadron. He didn't want it, tried to refuse. They made him take it anyway. Said the squadron needed someone who understood the ground war, someone who could see what intelligence couldn't see. He accepted because refusing would have meant getting pulled out of combat entirely, and he wasn't done yet. March brought the Rhine crossing, one of the largest operations of the war. Kessler's squadron flew constant patrols over the river, making sure German aircraft didn't interfere with the bridgehead. They saw almost no enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, planes, and pilots. The few that did come up were inexperienced, flying predictable patterns, easy targets. Kessler didn't feel good about killing them. They were just kids, 18, 19 years old, sent up in outdated aircraft with barely enough training to take off and land. But he killed them anyway, because if he didn't, they'd kill his bombers. That's how war worked. April. American forces were racing across Germany. The war was almost over. Everybody could feel it. Pilots started talking about what they'd do when they got home, where they'd go, what they'd eat, whether they'd keep flying or never get in an airplane again. Kessler didn't talk about any of that. He just flew his missions and waited. On April 21st, 1945, he flew his last combat mission, a routine patrol over western Germany. No enemy contact, no drama, just 2 hours of flying over devastated countryside, burned-out tanks, abandoned towns, roads full of refugees. When he landed back at base, someone told him the war would be over in 2 weeks. Kessler nodded and went to file his flight report. He was right. The war ended on May 8th. Kessler had flown 137 combat missions, spent over 400 hours in the cockpit over enemy territory, been credited with 23 confirmed kills and 16 probables. He'd been shot at thousands of times, been hit dozens of times, never been wounded, never lost a wingman, never failed to complete a mission. The Army wanted to keep him, offered him a regular commission, a career. He said no. He'd done what he'd been asked to do. Now he wanted to go home. They gave him the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters, the Presidential Unit Citation. He accepted them politely and put them in his footlocker. They meant something, just not as much as everyone seemed to think they should. He shipped back to the United States in June, arrived in New York Harbor on a troop ship with 3,000 other veterans. Everyone was celebrating. Bands playing, people cheering. Kessler stood at the rail and looked at the skyline and thought about the first time he'd seen it. On his way to basic training 3 years earlier, he'd been terrified then, thought he'd never see Wisconsin again. Now he was going home. It didn't feel real yet. He took a train to Chicago, another train to Milwaukee, a bus to Sheboygan Falls, got off at the main intersection with a duffel bag and his discharge papers, walked the 3 miles to the farm. His parents saw him coming up the road. His mother started crying before he even reached the porch. His father shook his hand and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked if Vernon was hungry. They went inside and ate dinner. Nobody talked about the war. The next morning, Kessler woke up at dawn, put on his work clothes, went out to the barn. The cows were exactly where they'd always been. He started the morning routine, milking, feeding, mucking out stalls. His hands remembered what to do. After 3 years of flying fighters, his body still knew how to work a farm. It was like he'd never left. One of the cows was limping, favoring her left rear leg. Kessler watched her for a minute, saw the way she was moving, knew exactly what was wrong. Stone bruise. Not serious, but painful. He'd treat it that evening. He moved on to the next cow, then the next. By the time he was done, the sun was fully up, and the morning felt like every other morning he'd ever known. A week later, a reporter from the local paper showed up. Wanted to do a story about the hometown hero. Asked Kessler about the war, about the missions, about the kills. Kessler answered the questions because it would have been rude not to. But he didn't elaborate, didn't tell stories, just gave facts. Yes, he'd been a pilot. Yes, he'd flown combat missions. Yes, he'd been decorated. The reporter asked him what the most important thing he'd learned was. Kessler thought about it. Then he said that the most important thing was knowing when to move fast and when to wait. Same as farming. The reporter wrote it down, but clearly didn't understand. Over the next few months, other veterans started coming back. Some of them stopped by the farm, wanted to talk, wanted to compare experiences. Kessler listened more than he talked. He noticed something. The men who'd been in the infantry, the ones who'd fought on the ground, they didn't want to talk about what they'd done. The men who'd been in support roles, the ones who'd been farther from the actual fighting, they wanted to tell stories, make it sound more dramatic than it had been. Kessler understood both reactions. Combat changed you. How it changed you depended on what you'd seen. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. By the end of 1945, Kessler had settled back into farm life. He married a woman named Helen, who'd grown up 2 farms over. She knew who he was, knew what he'd done, never asked him about it. They bought 30 more acres and expanded the dairy operation. Had 3 kids, raised them to work hard and pay attention, the same way Kessler had been raised. Occasionally, someone would ask him about the war, usually at church or town meetings. They'd heard stories, wanted to know if they were true. Kessler would smile and change the subject. He didn't want to be known as the war hero. He wanted to be known as a good farmer, a good husband, a good father. The war had been 3 years of his life. Important years, defining years, but they were over. In 1952, the Air Force invited him to Washington for a ceremony. They were honoring pilots from World War II, recognizing their contributions. Kessler almost didn't go, didn't see the point. But Helen convinced him, said it would be good for the kids to see. So he went, stood in a room with 200 other pilots, listened to speeches about bravery and sacrifice, accepted another medal, shook hands with generals who'd been captains when he knew them. At the reception afterward, he met a Luftwaffe pilot who'd moved to America after the war. The man recognized Kessler's name, said he'd flown against him in 1944, asked if Kessler remembered a fight over northern France where an American pilot had herded 8 German fighters into a contrail bank. Kessler said he remembered. The German pilot extended his hand, said it had been the most frustrating combat experience of his career. He'd felt like he was fighting someone who could see the future. Kessler shook his hand and told him it hadn't been the future, just the weather. They talked for a while, about flying, about tactics, about how strange it was to have been enemies and now be standing in the same room as civilians. The German pilot asked what Kessler did now. Kessler told him he was a dairy farmer. The German pilot laughed, said that made sense, that the way Kessler had fought had always seemed more like animal husbandry than combat aviation. Kessler didn't disagree. Over the years, Kessler was invited to speak at schools, veterans organizations, Air Force bases. He'd usually say, Continuer 11, 10D. No. When he said yes, he kept it brief. Talked about the importance of paying attention, about trusting your instincts, about understanding that every skill you learn, even if it seems unrelated, might be useful someday. He never talked about kills, never talked about danger, focused on the lessons, the things that mattered after the shooting stopped. In the 1960s, a military historian tracked him down, was writing a book about American fighter tactics in World War II, wanted to interview Kessler at length. They spent 3 days going through mission reports, comparing Kessler's recollections with official records, trying to understand how he'd achieved what he'd achieved. At the end of it, the historian admitted he still didn't fully understand. Kessler's methods didn't fit any established doctrine. They were improvisational, instinctive, based on principles that predated aviation. The historian published the book in 1967, dedicated an entire chapter to Kessler, called him one of the most innovative tactical minds of the war. Kessler read the chapter once and never looked at it again. It made him sound like someone he didn't recognize, someone who'd been trying to revolutionize air combat. He hadn't been trying to do that. He'd just been trying to stay alive and keep his people alive. The innovation had been a side effect. By the 1970s, most people in Sheboygan Falls had forgotten that Kessler had been a fighter pilot. He was just the guy who ran the dairy farm on County Road M, the guy who always knew when it was going to rain, the guy whose cows were always healthy and whose crops always came in on time. He was fine with that, preferred it actually. In 1984, the Air Force flew him out to Nevada. They were testing a new fighter aircraft, wanted input from veteran pilots. Kessler was 61 years old, hadn't flown in almost 40 years. They put him in the cockpit anyway, let him take the plane up. He flew for 30 minutes. When he landed, the test pilots asked him what he thought. Kessler said it was too complicated, too many systems, too much technology between the pilot and the aircraft. You couldn't feel what the plane was doing anymore, couldn't read the air. They thanked him for his input and didn't invite him back. Helen died in 1991. Heart attack. She was 68. They'd been married for 45 years. Kessler scattered her ashes over the farm. Then he kept working, got up every morning, fed the animals, maintained the equipment, watched the sky. People told him he should retire, sell the farm, move into town. He ignored them. The farm wasn't just his livelihood, it was who he was. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, a television crew came to interview him. They wanted to film him talking about his experiences, about the men he'd served with, about what victory had meant. Kessler let them film, answered their questions. But when they asked him to summarize what the war had taught him, he gave them an answer they didn't expect. He said the war had taught him that skill matters less than attention, that you could be the best pilot in the world, but if you weren't paying attention, you'd die, and that everything you learn in peacetime, even things that seem useless, might save your life in war. He said he'd survived because he'd been a farmer first and a pilot second, and that he'd been a better pilot because he'd been a farmer. The interview aired on the local news. Someone posted it online years later. It got a few thousand views, comments from people who'd never heard of Vernon Kessler, who didn't know that there had been a dairy farmer from Wisconsin who'd confused and terrified the Luftwaffe, who'd used cattle herding tactics to win dogfights, who'd never fired a shot in anger, but had killed 23 enemy fighters and saved hundreds of lives. Kessler died in 2003. He was 80 years old. The funeral was small, family and a few neighbors. No military honors. He'd specified in his will that he didn't want any. No flag on the casket, no rifle salute. He was a farmer. That's how he wanted to be remembered. They buried him next to Helen on a hill overlooking the farm. The same farm where he'd learned to read the weather, to watch animals, to pay attention to things that other people missed. His children sold the farm 6 months later, couldn't keep it running, didn't have their father's instincts. The new owners turned it into a corn operation. The dairy barn is still there, empty now. But if you stand in the right spot and look up at the sky, you can imagine a young man who learned to herd cows by watching their behavior, who took those lessons into the air over Europe, who confused and frustrated enemy pilots who had 10 times his experience, who survived 137 missions by trusting instincts that had nothing to do with war. The Germans called him Vogelscheuche, scarecrow, because he appeared where he wasn't supposed to be, did things that didn't make sense, made experienced pilots second-guess themselves. The Americans called him the best hunter in the 8th Air Force. But Vernon Kessler never thought of himself as either of those things. He was a farmer who'd spent 3 years flying fighters, and when the flying was done, he went back to the farm, because that's where he belonged. His medals are in a box at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. His flight logs are archived at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. His aircraft, a P-47 Thunderbolt with 43 mission markers painted on the fuselage, was scrapped in 1946. But his story remains, not because he wanted recognition. He never did. His story remains because it teaches something important. That unconventional thinking wins wars. That skills transfer in unexpected ways. That a man who knows how to move cattle might also know how to move fighters. And that sometimes, the best weapon isn't training or technology, it's instinct. The officers who called his farmer's trick worthless learned that lesson the hard way. So did 8 veteran Luftwaffe pilots who couldn't understand how a 21-year-old farm boy was outthinking them. They learned that war isn't just about who has the better equipment or the more experience. It's about who can adapt, who can see patterns that others miss, who can take everything they've ever learned, no matter how irrelevant it seems, and use it to survive. Vernon Kessler did that better than almost anyone. Not because he was trying to be innovative, not because he wanted to change tactics, but because he paid attention to the sky, to the enemy, to the way things moved and sounded and felt. The same way he'd paid attention to the weather over Wisconsin fields, to the behavior of dairy cows, to the 1,000 small details that separate a good farmer from a failed one. He went to war as a farm boy, came home as an ace, spent the rest of his life as a farmer again, and never thought any of it was particularly remarkable. That might be the most remarkable thing about him. He did extraordinary things and treated them as ordinary, saved lives and called it common sense, changed the way fighter pilots thought about tactics and considered it just paying attention. The Luftwaffe put a bounty on him. The Air Force gave him medals. History books dedicated chapters to him. And Vernon Kessler just wanted to go home and milk his cows. Because at the end of the day, That's what made sense to him. War was temporary. Necessary, but temporary. The farm was permanent. The land, the animals, the rhythm of seasons and weather and work, that was real. Everything else was just interruption. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. There's a lesson in that. In a world that celebrates combat and courage and sacrifice, Vernon Kessler reminds us that the goal isn't glory. It's going home. It's returning to the life you had before. It's taking off the uniform and putting on work clothes. It's trading a fighter aircraft for a tractor. It's measuring success not by how many enemies you killed, but by how many springs you get to see on your own land. He confused 8 veteran pilots in seconds because he thought differently. Not better, not worse, just differently. He saw the sky the way he saw his fields, as something alive and changing. Something that would tell you its secrets if you paid attention. Something that rewarded patience and punished assumptions. The German pilots were looking for tactics. Kessler was reading weather. They were thinking 3 moves ahead. He was thinking 3 hours ahead. Different game, different rules, different outcome. That's what made him dangerous. Not his marksmanship, not his aggression, his perception. He saw what was about to happen before it happened, not through some mystical gift, through observation, through understanding patterns, through years of watching animals and weather and learning that everything announces itself if you're paying attention. A cow getting sick shows symptoms days before it collapses. A storm coming shows signs hours before it arrives. A German ambush shows patterns minutes before it springs. Kessler saw the patterns. That's all. That's everything. And when the war was over, he went back to Wisconsin and used those same skills to run a successful farm for 58 years. Because the skills that keep you alive in combat are the same skills that keep a farm running. Attention, patience, the ability to read subtle signs, the willingness to trust your instincts when the data is incomplete. He died without fanfare, without headlines, just the way he'd lived after the war. Quietly, competently, with his attention focused on the things that mattered to him, his family, his land, his animals, the life he'd fought to preserve and then return to when the fighting was done. He didn't need the world to remember him as a hero. He needed his cows to be healthy and his crops to come in on time. Everything else was just noise. But we remember him anyway, not because he sought fame, because his story matters, because it reminds us that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like farmers. Sometimes the skills that save lives come from unexpected places. Sometimes the greatest tactical minds aren't the ones trained in tactics. They're the ones trained in attention. Vernon Kessler confused 8 veteran pilots in seconds using a farmer's trick. He survived 137 combat missions using instincts he'd developed herding cows. He changed the way the Air Force thought about fighter combat by refusing to fight the way he'd been taught. And then he went home and never talked about it again. Because to him, it wasn't exceptional. It was just what needed to be done. That's the story, not of a superhero, of a farm boy who paid attention, who trusted what he'd learned, who refused to stop being himself just because he was in a war, who took the sky over Europe and treated it the same way he treated the sky over Wisconsin, as something to be read and understood, as something that would cooperate if you respected it, as something that would kill you if you didn't. The officers stopped laughing when 8 veteran pilots couldn't figure out which way was up. They stopped calling it a farmer's trick when it kept working. They stopped questioning him when he kept surviving, and Vernon Kessler kept flying the only way he knew how, with his eyes on the sky, his instincts engaged, his farmer's mind turning every dogfight into a herding exercise, every patrol into a weather reading, every mission into a problem that could be solved if you just paid enough attention. He didn't think he was changing anything. He was just doing his job, the way he'd been taught, by his father, by the land, by 21 years of watching and learning and understanding that nothing happens without warning. Everything announces itself. Enemy aircraft, sick animals, coming storms, failed crops. You just have to be paying attention. You just have to trust what you see. You just have to act on what you know. Vernon Kessler did that. For 3 years in combat, for 58 years on the farm, until his last breath. He paid attention. He trusted his instincts. He did what needed to be done, and he never thought any of it made him special. That's what made him special. The complete lack of ego, the absence of drama, the quiet certainty that he was exactly who he'd always been. A farmer from Wisconsin who'd spent some time in a war. The Luftwaffe never figured him out. The Air Force never fully understood him. The historians never quite captured him. Because Vernon Kessler wasn't complicated. He was simple. Deeply, powerfully simple. He saw, he understood, he acted, and when it was over, he went home. That's the whole story. Everything else is just details. So when you hear about the farmer who confused 8 veteran pilots in seconds, remember this. He didn't do it with technology, didn't do it with superior training, didn't do it with aggression or courage or any of the things we usually associate with combat success. He did it with attention, with instinct, with the accumulated wisdom of 21 years spent watching cows and weather and learning that everything tells you what it's going to do if you're willing to listen. That's the lesson. Not that you need to be the best, that you need to pay attention, not that you need fancy tactics, that you need to trust what you know. Not that you need to reinvent yourself for every new challenge, that you need to bring yourself, whole and complete, to every challenge and let your accumulated experience guide you. Vernon Kessler brought the farm to the war, and the war never knew what hit it. That's his legacy. Not the medals, not the kill count, not the recognition. The simple truth that attention matters more than intention. That instinct can defeat training. That unconventional thinking starts with being exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. He never apologized for being a farmer in a pilot's war. He just flew like a farmer and let the results speak for themselves. 23 confirmed kills, 137 missions, 0 losses. Those numbers tell a story, but the real story is in what they don't say. How many American crews made it home because Kessler found the ambush first? How many missions succeeded because he saw what nobody else could see? How many lives were saved by a young man who'd learned to read the sky over Wisconsin and brought that skill to the sky over Europe? We'll never know those numbers, but Vernon Kessler knew, and that was enough for him. He didn't need the world to keep score. He kept his own score, in survived missions, in preserved lives, in a return to the farm that proved the war hadn't changed what mattered, and in 58 years of quiet work after the noise stopped. Years that said more about who he was than any combat record ever could. The officers called it worthless. The pilots called it genius. Vernon Kessler called it paying attention. And all three were right. It was worthless until it wasn't. It was genius because it was simple. It was paying attention because that's all it ever was. The rest wrote itself. That's how wars are won.